Hey guys, I'm Mitch Watson and I'm known as the Paw Professor. I'm a dog trainer from Brisbane, Australia, and prior to this, I was a police dog handler for 10 years. For the past 5 years now, I've been helping dog owners transform their relationship with their dog, from simple issues such as pulling on the lead, jumping up and running off, just to name a few. These common issues can be quite easily resolved if you understand what to do and use the correct approach. I'd like to teach you a system that I've devised. I've called it the 3-point sliding scale. I truly believe if you understand and implement this correctly, you too can have amazing results and have better control of your dog. Here's to a more enjoyable walk with your dog.
Take me back to the jungle. Take me back to the jungle.
Okay, this topic has caused debate and divisions in the dog training world and even among dog owners. I'm talking about whether we train our dogs with just a reward-based method or use a balanced approach. By balanced, I mean a combination of rewards as well as using corrections. Some people are strongly opposed to the idea of a balanced approach, and they're entitled to that opinion. Years ago, there was a strong emphasis on compulsion training. However, personally, the advent of a more scientific approach in terms of positive reinforcement has been fantastic, and there are so many great positive reinforcement trainers out there. I say, if you can train your dog with just a reward-based method, stick to it, why not? However, if this isn't working for you, and by that I mean your dog's behaviour is causing you to leave him or her at home rather than take them out, then you really should consider using a balanced approach. We as humans go through life with both rewards and consequences. As kids, we burn our hands on the stove, get our finger jammed in the door, stub our toe, just to name a few. That's how we learn and hope not to repeat the same silly behaviour. Without us intervening, dogs also learn from their natural environment. For example, an adult dog teaches the puppy not to steal a bone off them. The adult dog would growl and then physically correct the pup. There are heaps more examples of how dogs learn from a painful experience in their natural environment. So why is it then we as humans expect our dogs to do everything we want if there is no consequence? The argument a pure-based, reward-based trainer would use is, of course we use consequences. We put them in time out. My answer to this is, you show me the last time an adult dog put a puppy in time out for stealing a bone off them. So reward-based training is fantastic to begin with. However, from my experience, many of the dogs will fail when placed in a distracted environment. By that, I mean continuing with just a reward-based approach after the dog understands the command will often not work when faced with a stimulated environment. I'd love $1 for every time I've heard, oh, he should be okay by the time he's about 3 years of age. Most of us in this modern world don't want to wait until our dog is 3. Using a balanced approach can achieve these results far quicker.
Take me back to the jungle.
The following few minutes may seem a bit deep and boring. However, I'd like you to hang in there a bit longer and we'll get to the 3-point sliding scale soon. Some people have heard of classical conditioning or Pavlov's theory. Pavlov was a Russian scientist that conducted an experiment whereby he rang a bell prior to giving a dog food. After repeating this a number of times, he discovered that the dog would salivate just by the mere sounding of the bell without being given the food. This type of response from the dog was involuntary. They had no control of themselves salivating as a direct result of the bell ringing. The other associated learning that I'd like to concentrate on is operant conditioning. Not many people have heard of this really interesting learning process. Although it's well documented in the dog training world, and I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel, however, I hope this makes it a little easier to understand. It relates to all humans and animals in terms of how they learn. It's the framework of behaviour modification, irrespective of whether you use a positive reinforcement approach or a balanced training approach. Basically, it's where the dog's behaviour and the immediate consequence, whether this be good or bad, will shape the future behaviour. Simply put, the dog will associate a specific behaviour they do will affect them either positively or negatively. So when placed in the same situation in the future, they will make a voluntary and conscious decision to alter the outcome. As a result of this, they will attempt to repeat actions or behaviours that give them good outcomes and avoid actions or behaviours that give them bad outcomes. Humans are exactly the same. From a young age, we all have intentions to go through life increasing the good outcomes and reducing the bad outcomes. To be honest, understanding operant conditioning can be quite difficult to get your head around. Try to understand it. However, if you find it confusing, don't worry about it too much. I'd rather you focus on what we need to do to either increase a particular behaviour or decrease a particular behaviour. In terms of my training philosophy, and I emphasise mine because it relates to a balanced method, do we either give the dog something it likes or a consequence immediately after a behaviour. Have a look at the following diagram. However, just before I do this, I'd like to explain what the word aversive means in relation to training. This is where an unpleasant stimulus occurs immediately following a behaviour, and as a result, that behaviour is less likely to occur in the future. So now the diagram is up, I'll give you an example of each quadrant. Positive reinforcement. An example of this is giving your dog a treat when it sits. We added a treat, and as a result, the dog will be more inclined to sit in the future. Positive punishment. An example of this is spraying water in the dog's face from a bottle or water pistol when it jumps on you. Here, by adding an aversive, the dog is less inclined to repeat the action of jumping up. Negative reinforcement. I'll give you 3 examples of this one. Number 1, removing leash pressure when the dog eventually sits or lays down. Number 2, stopping the application of an e-collar when the dog comes to you. Number 3, the dog stops pulling when he or she wears a halty. Yes, the halty is an aversive. The reason why the dog stops pulling is because the halty gives them an unpleasant feeling on their nose when they pull. In all of these examples, we removed an aversive, and as a result, the dog is less likely to repeat the action or behaviour. That is, the behaviour is going to decrease. Negative punishment. Turning your back on a dog that is jumping up on you, and then when the dog sits, you turn and engage with it. So in this example, we removed affection from the dog, and as a result, the dog is less inclined to jump. So hopefully the behaviour will decrease in the future. Whilst on this example, the issue of giving a dog a treat to stop jumping on you is that you may in fact be teaching the dog to jump. The dog will repeat the action just prior to the treat, which was jumping. Positive trainers generally focus on positive reinforcement and negative punishment, although as I've pointed out, many just use a halty, and this by definition is negative reinforcement. As I've touched on, my training philosophy is to use positive reinforcement with no distractions so the dog learns the action or behaviour we want it to do. It will learn these actions or behaviours because it wants to and not because it's forced. Only after the dog knows and understands the individual actions, we then want to add the distractions to the dog's life and still have it achieve the same action. To do this, I'd like to introduce avoidance training. Avoidance training is where the dog will attempt to prevent an aversive from occurring. As you can see on the diagram, this falls under the category of negative reinforcement. This is basically the pairing of a command with a consequence or possible consequence. You can teach your dog to do this by simply giving it a command just prior to the aversive. In future, your dog will stop doing what it's about to do in order to avoid a consequence. The timing of the command and correction is important for this phenomenon to take place. If the command is not given immediately before the correction, the dog will not associate the correlation between the two. In other words, the dog will just get the correction for the behaviour it has done at the specific time. It is absolutely imperative that the command must be paired with the aversive. I will repeat this again because it's really important. It is absolutely imperative that the command must be paired with the aversive. I'll outline a couple of examples to explain this. One example I give to clients here in Australia is if you're driving your car down the road and you're speeding and an oncoming car flashes you with its headlights, you will slow down to the speed limit. The reason you do this is to avoid a consequence, which is a hefty fine. Ordinarily, the flashing of the headlights wouldn't mean anything. However, given the fact that someone flashes you whilst you are speeding, you are able to avoid that consequence. The flashing of the lights has been paired with the consequence. Another example is a hidden fence for a dog. The dog will associate the beep on the collar prior to getting a correction on the collar. Next time the dog hears the beep on the collar, it will not proceed over the boundary fence markers in order to reduce an aversive. The last example is when your dog jumps on the couch. Just prior to doing this action, if you rang a bell or said and then applied an aversive, when they touched the couch, they would soon learn to avoid the couch when you next said that command. The dog would quickly learn it has the capacity to change the outcome. The cool thing about this is, let's say 5 minutes later, if the same dog was to jump on a bed in a different room, and you rang the bell or said the dog would most likely not jump on that bed. So the will work on different subjects, for example, jumping on a person, grabbing a sock off the ground, stealing food from the table, and the list goes on. It will do this to reduce the likelihood of an unpleasant experience. That unpleasant experience could range from a squirty bottle to an e-collar. So what's an appropriate aversive? Today, apart from the normal flat collar, the most common things used are the harness and Halti. Personally, I don't use them, and I'll outline my reasons now. Regarding a harness, there's a multitude of them out there, and they say that they stop your dog from pulling. Speaking to a lot of clients who have used them, say that it stopped their dog pulling for a short time, however within no time started pulling again. The reason for this is they got used to the aversive. Not only that, there is a reason why sled dogs use harnesses, and it's not to stop them pulling. The Halti is the same. The only reason most dogs stop pulling on the lead with a Halti is because it creates a discomfort on the nose when they pull on the lead. Do you really think that they enjoy wearing a strap around their nose? I don't want to be a huge critic of Haltis, however I can say with my hand on my heart that I've seen more than my fair share of dog owners turn up for a session with a dog distressed wearing a Halti. Another item is a martingale collar. They are the ones with fabric and a few links of chain. Again, I've seen heaps of dogs choking themselves on these. The issue I have with a harness or a Halti is that we are taking away our ability to pair our voice with an independent correction. It's just not possible to do this using those devices. It doesn't allow you enough time to activate your voice before the pressure is on the dog. The Halti in particular is an automatic aversive. When the leash goes tight, it places discomfort on the nose. The dog doesn't get a chance to make a decision. Personally, for domestic dogs, I prefer a remote collar or the old-fashioned check chain. Some people give them a bad name due to the way they are used or even referred to. For example, shock collars or choke chains. Remote collars are awesome and more humane if you know how to use them correctly, and more importantly, you use a good quality one. Years ago, they weren't as advanced as they are today, and the cheap ones should be outlawed. They are cruel and totally inappropriate. I don't mean the longevity or the warranty, etc. I'm referring to how long they activate for and the level of correction on the lowest setting. We want a collar that has the ability to do a really quick correction and then stop. The majority of the cheap ones are strong on the low setting and go for over a second when applied. One of the best examples of this is when you use an e-collar to stop a dog jumping on a person. You want it to only correct them at the specific time that they touch the person. A cheap collar will continue to correct the dog when it is not jumping. This is cruel and makes no sense. It's also really important that prior to using the e-collar, put it on your arm or neck and use it. If you can't do this, then why would you put it on your dog? As for check chains, they are definitely not there to choke a dog. In fact, the complete opposite. You want a check chain that is smooth through the links and flows efficiently. I know that the metal scares people, however, being metal allows them to make a noise and release more effectively, unlike the items like a harness and Halti. We humans are more accepting of those, however, mechanically, they don't release as well. I'm not saying that a check chain will work on all dogs, and you can only discover this upon trying it. I'll go through these in more detail later. Okay, that's enough of that. Now to the anticipated 3-point sliding scale. Okay, it sounds crazy, however, after you understand this scale, always try to relate it back to resolving 90% of the issues you face with your dog. From recall, pulling on the lead, jumping up on guests, grabbing items like socks and running off through the house, to running the fence line and barking at people. Okay, now let's just say that I'm a dog and my name's Ralph. Now you're my owner and I'm going to do something for either a ball, a treat or praise, nothing else. So let's just say that the value of that is only worth $1. Now it's my job to collect the $1 and it's your job to give them to me. You can teach me to do certain things like come, sit, lay down and a bunch of other things. You can do this say 50 times, 100 times, 1 month, 6 months, you name it. Fantastic. That's straight positive reinforcement. By adding $1 to my life, I'm keen on doing things for you. Now let's just say behind me, right there where that tree is, a nice person puts down a $20 note. Let's call that a distraction. Where do you think I'm going to go? I've told this analogy to thousands and thousands of people, and I've never heard one person tell me that I wouldn't go for the $20 note. Now, as we can see on the animation, as I start to head off towards the $20, that value exponentially grows. As I go halfway, the value would be possibly 25, and then if I'm only a couple of meters away from it, it's maybe 30. These are just random values. However, the point I'm trying to make here is that as your dog extends away, there are a few things in play. Your value is definitely only worth $1, if anything, slightly less. Likewise, the value of the distraction grows. If you're using a straight positive reinforcement approach, you need to break the rules and get a higher value than $30. Basically, we're then just bribing Ralph. The problem with that is, Ralph will at some time want something more than what you have to offer. So this is where we must consider avoidance training. As we've discovered, avoidance training is the pairing of a command with an aversive. So what we need to do is first teach Ralph to come without the $20 distraction. That's straight positive reinforcement.
He's a good boy.
After we've achieved this, we can manipulate this equation by two variables. The first being the variable of the distraction, and the second being the distance that Ralph is to the distraction. It would be cruel and unfair for Ralph if A, he didn't know come, and B, we made the value $1 million. He'd run off having no idea what's going on. So first, let's place Ralph in a situation where he now sees a $20 note. Ralph looks up and goes ripper and starts to wander off to the slightly better option. See, Ralph knows that you only have $1 in your pocket. He'd prefer $20. Now, as Ralph starts off to head towards the $20, we can ask Ralph to come in a happy voice. If he turns and comes back to the $1, fantastic, praise him. However, if he doesn't, we need to say a command, and I often use or leave it. Slightly thereafter, Ralph must get a correction of some description. As we've learned with avoidance training, the correction must be very close to the command so that the pairing of the command is strong. If it's not close, then Ralph won't associate the correction with the command. As soon as Ralph turns back towards us, we maximise praise and make a huge deal for Ralph to come back to us so he can collect his $1, the treat. So picture this, if we put a clock face out where Ralph is standing and 12 o'clock is pointing towards the owner, then we want to praise Ralph between 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock. When Ralph makes a decision to go to the better option, when he reaches either 10 o'clock or 2 o'clock, all the way through to 4 o'clock or 8 o'clock, we give Ralph the When he looks anywhere between 4 o'clock and 8 o'clock, we apply the aversive. The E-collar is my preference for this for a number of reasons. Firstly, there is no lead. Secondly, if done properly, Ralph has no correlation to us correcting him. He doesn't have the intellect to know that we applied the aversive. Dogs don't go to a school and learn about electronic radio systems. They purely think in sequences and associate a behaviour they did and whether that resulted in either a positive outcome or a negative outcome. In future times, Ralph will make a decision based on the previous experience to avoid a negative outcome and give himself a positive outcome. Who would want to do that? Picture this, if a dog disliked water being squirted in the face and we could mount a squirty bottle on their head and control it remotely, there is absolutely no difference in terms of the psychology. The fact that it's water is easy for us humans to accept. However, it would only work on a dog that dislikes water in the face. By definition, it's still an aversive. It just so happens actually that these have recently hit the market. So basically, after doing this a few times, the dog will start to have authentic value for the A. A lot of trainers using e-collars around the world may use a slightly different method. For example, many would say the come command and immediately press the e-collar on a mild aversive and continue to hold the aversive on the dog until the dog comes towards you. This is making the dog escape the aversive, which they will soon learn to avoid after hearing the come command. Whilst this will make the dog sharpen its recall, I found that the huge majority of domestic pet owners prefer to be slightly less strict and give the dog an aversive only after they turn their head to ignore the come command. Now getting back to our diagram with Ralph. Now let's say that the value of the distraction is $20. When Ralph doesn't obey us and we say the correction Ralph receives must outweigh his desire for a $20 note. By manipulating the 3-point sliding scale, the correction doesn't need to be that strong. However, the correction must be $25 worth of discomfort. We have then paired our voice with a $20 distraction. So in the future, when Ralph sees a $20 note, by us saying he will listen to us. So moving on, if we then jump to a $500 distraction, Ralph is most likely going to not obey us. That's because we haven't paired our voice with that value. However, we can achieve this in no time if we manipulate the 3-point sliding scale. We could do this by calling back Ralph at different intervals, distances, when using the same level of distraction. By intervals, I mean 20% of the way to the distraction, 50% and 90% and so on. This in turn will slightly change the value and Ralph will require a slightly greater correction. Next, we can then increase the level of the value to, let's say, 100 and then start the process again. For example, correcting 20% of the way, 50% and 90% of the way to the distraction. Next, $1,000 and repeat the same process, etc. Awesome Recall is getting Ralph to come back from a distraction worth $1 million when he is 90% of the way to it.
Good boy. He's a good boy.
So to recap, the 3-point sliding scale has 3 rules. The first one, you're always point number 1 and never more than $1, except for one exemption, which I will talk of shortly. Number 2, your dog will always be point number 2, and this will never change. And finally, point number 3 is the distraction. This can be as little as 1 distraction or multiple distractions. For example, heaps of dogs in a dog park, and it can vary dynamically with the changes in values as they come and go from point number 2. Picture you at 0 meters and the distraction being at 10 meters. Point number 2, Ralph, can stretch from anywhere between 0 and 10 meters. Let's say for argument's sake that the distraction is worth $20 when Ralph is 8 meters towards the distraction. Without using any corrections, it's to your benefit to move closer, thus decreasing the distance to Ralph. Now picture yourself at 4 meters. You've magically, albeit slightly, increased your value. Also, depending on the situation, either make a huge happy sound to attract Ralph, or by crouching down, you will give yourself slightly more value. A good example of this is when you're at home and someone knocks on the front door. When they knock on the door, that person all of a sudden becomes a $20 note. If you're at the back of the house, you'll be at 0 meters. Your dog, point number 2, races down the hallway and stands barking with excitement that someone is at the front door. Now that the dog's at the front door, he's 8 meters from you and only 2 meters from the distraction. The distraction would now be worth $50. Ideally, we need the value of the distraction to reduce. If the guest is calm and ignore the dog, they reduce their value of the $50. This in turn will make your job easier. Now, if you come in closer to the dog, you'll magically increase your value. If you then crouch down with a treat, you will have a really good chance of getting your dog back to you without any corrections. If you do use corrections, the timing and voice inflections are absolutely crucial. I will repeat this because it is super important. The timing and voice inflections are absolutely crucial. On a slightly different topic, many people ask me about clicker training and if it's the same. Clicker training or marker training uses a unique sound or word and associates this with a reward for the dog. For example, if you applied the click when your dog sat 10 meters away from you, the dog will associate that it received that reward at the time that the click was made. Although you give the dog a treat upon returning, it will know that it only received the treat for the sit some meters away. The issue with this is the click is still only worth $1, and placed in a competing interest, it will fail. Okay, the objective here is to have our dog walk on a loose lead, whether we use a harness, flat collar, a check chain, or any other item for that matter. As we know with operant conditioning, we want to increase the behaviour of Ralph when he's beside our left leg and decrease the behaviour of when Ralph is in front of us. Now, just to be a bit more annoying, it's time for one more diagram. So here we have Ralph and his owner, and we're looking at them from above. As you can see, Ralph is sitting in a green box. Just outside that box is an orange box, and just outside that is a red box, similar to a universal traffic light, green, orange, red. Again, let's refer back to the 3-point sliding scale. You're point number 1 and Ralph is point number 2. Ralph needs to be given heaps of $1 when he's in the green box. This is positive reinforcement. Unfortunately, Ralph gets a little too excited and wants to start pulling to his $50, the 3rd point, as you can see. Before we approach the dog that's walking towards us, Ralph is still pretty keen on the $1 that I'm giving him. However, as we get closer to the other dog, this dog is increasing in value really quickly. The oncoming dog may start out at $20 when it's about 30 metres away. However, it could soon increase to $500 when it gets right beside us. After we walk past the dog, the value just as quickly drops. So now that we're all experts with the 3-point sliding scale, we all know that Ralph should be given a command like R or leave it prior to any independent correction. This correction can be applied from anything from a flat collar, check chain or an e-collar, even a squirty bottle for that matter. As you may have guessed, we want to praise Ralph when he's in the green box, give him a cursory command when he's just about to touch the orange line, and then a correction on the red line. Ralph will soon learn to stop touching the red line. This technique will be later outlined in detail on one of the demo dogs in the video. If Ralph is a big puller on the lead, we want to slow down just as we say ah. The idea of this is when Ralph makes a voluntary decision to return to the green box, we're in a perfect position to speed up and give him what he wants, thus positively reinforcing him. So in effect, if Ralph complies with 2 simple rules, he gets to go faster, which is what he wants. And those rules are, number 1, he must have no tension on the lead, and number 2, he's beside our left leg. As we've learned with operant conditioning, Ralph will repeat an action or behaviour based on a previous experience. That is, walking in front and not listening to the command will result in a negative outcome, and walking beside the owner will result in a positive outcome.